There's a metal canister sitting on a forgotten shelf in a studio storage facility just off Sunset. No label on the lid. Just a strip of brittle masking tape curling at the edges. If you pry it open, and almost no one does, you'll find a short reel of nitrate film leader, cloudy and brittle with age. The footage attached to it doesn't match any officially released print. That canister is the ghost detail. And it's the first crack in the story Hollywood tried to erase forever. Most people think old Hollywood scandals were loud. Affairs splashed across tabloids, arrests, morality clauses snapped into place like traps. But the real scandals, the dangerous ones, were quiet. They happened in editing rooms after midnight, in executive offices with the blinds half drawn, in phone calls that never made it into memos. This one began with studio manipulation so refined it felt almost polite. The film was called The Lantern's Edge, mid-1948, a post-war drama about a returning veteran who stumbles into a web of civic corruption in his California hometown. On the surface, it was timely, even patriotic, but beneath that surface was something sharper. The script suggested that power wasn't just flawed, it was coordinated. Judges, newspaper publishers, business leaders, all connected. And that's where hidden influence started to sweat. Because the studio backing the film had investment ties to real estate developers and media owners in Los Angeles. Quiet partnerships, boardroom handshakes, the kind of relationships that don't show up in press kits but decide which projects get greenlit. The veteran's fictional town looked a little too much like home. Now here's what most film histories leave out. Old Hollywood ran on ghost workflows, invisible systems that shaped movies long before the cameras rolled. Uncredited script adjusters who specialized in softening dialogue, internal sensitivity readers who weren't checking for social harm, they were checking for political friction, publicity teams who drafted alternate narratives weeks before a premiere, just in case. They didn't destroy films outright. That would have been messy. They thinned them, trimmed them, nudged them until the sharp edges felt round. The pivot point came during a closed-door screening in a small projection room on the lot. No red carpet, no photographers, just studio executives, 2 major theater chain representatives, and a nationally syndicated columnist known for shaping public opinion with a single, well-placed paragraph. Halfway through the film, there's a scene set in a courtroom. You don't serve justice. You manage perception. The room went still. It wasn't the performance, it wasn't the lighting, it was the implication. That line didn't just accuse a fictional judge. It echoed too close to how the studio system itself operated. Manage perception, protect the institution, control the narrative. Within 24 hours, 3 things happened. First, the head of production ordered a technical review of the film's pacing. Second, the columnist published a think piece about restoring faith in American institutions during uncertain times. No mention of the film, just atmosphere. Third, the studio's publicity department quietly shifted marketing dollars toward a musical scheduled for the same quarter. That's how media spin worked when it was at its most sophisticated. No denials, no confrontations, just redirection. The editing room became the crime scene. Reels were reopened under the excuse of tightening runtime. The courtroom confrontation was trimmed by almost 40 seconds. The close-up on the judge's reaction was shortened, and that line, the one that cracked the glass, was redubbed. Now the veteran says, "Sometimes people make mistakes. Mistakes. Not corruption, not coordination, just human error. It's like watching a blade get dipped in water until it loses its edge." The forgotten techniques are what make this scandal fascinating. Back then, studios employed dialogue loopers who could match lip movements with near-surgical precision. Entire meanings could be altered without audiences noticing. It was a craft, delicate, almost invisible. They called it sweetening, a harmless word for something that fundamentally changed a story's spine. The director protested, quietly. He argued the tension would collapse. He was reminded of his contract. The screenwriter pushed harder. His option for the next project was not renewed. Officially, it was creative fatigue. Privately, he was labeled unstable. When The Lantern's Edge finally premiered, reviews described it as earnest but unfocused. Critics sensed something uneven but couldn't name it. The audience felt a flicker of confrontation that never quite ignited. The film performed modestly, not a flop, not a triumph. Just safe. Safe was the goal. Over the next few years, you can trace a pattern. Fewer films questioned institutional authority. Corrupt officials became rare, isolated villains instead of systemic players. Cynicism was rationed. Optimism became policy. The long-term Hollywood impact wasn't a headline. It was a narrowing, like a lens slowly tightening until only certain angles were allowed through. And that nitrate reel in the unmarked canister? It holds the original courtroom scene, the unsoftened line, the judge's full reaction shot, proof that the story once cut deeper. It's brittle now. One spark and it would vanish. Which feels fitting, because the scandal wasn't about a movie failing. It was about a system proving it could rewrite reality after the cameras stopped rolling. And if they could do it that smoothly, if they could erase a sharper truth without anyone noticing, what else did they thin out before we ever had the chance to see it? The morning after the re-edit order went out, nothing looked different on the lot. Extras lined up near wardrobe, a delivery truck rattled past stage 8. Somewhere, a tap routine echoed against plywood flats. That's the thing about hidden influence. It doesn't change the weather. It adjusts the temperature a single degree at a time. But inside the administrative building, behind frosted glass doors, the machinery was moving. Studio manipulation in the late 1940s wasn't chaotic. It was procedural. There were routing slips, internal codes, quiet chains of approval. When The Lantern's Edge was flagged for technical refinement, it triggered a workflow most outsiders never knew existed. The film didn't go back to the director first. It went to the internal review committee, 3 executives and 1 legal advisor whose job was to assess exposure. Not artistic exposure, political and financial. Here's the unexpected part. One of those executives sat on the board of a regional newspaper group. Another had investment ties to a defense contractor. The fictional corruption in the film mirrored real investigations happening in congressional subcommittees at the time. Nothing proven. Just whispers. But whispers were enough. The committee didn't argue about art. They discussed optics. That's the phrase that kept coming up in meeting notes recovered years later. Optics. Not truth, not integrity, optics. Ghost workflows kicked in again. A script consultant was brought back under a short-term contract. His specialty wasn't structure, it was dilution. He combed through the film's most confrontational exchanges and marked them with grease pencil. The goal wasn't to erase conflict entirely, it was to isolate it, turn systemic rot into individual weakness. So, the corrupt judge? He now had a gambling problem, a personal flaw. The newspaper editor who buried evidence? He was protecting his sick wife from scandal. Motives became human, messy, forgivable. It's like taking a cracked mirror and blaming a single chip instead of the pressure behind it. Media spin followed in layers. Trade papers received early access to a revised press kit framing the film as a study in moral resilience. The language shifted from accusation to redemption. The columnist who'd attended the private screening published another piece, this time praising Hollywood's responsible storytelling in a tense political climate. Responsible. That word did a lot of work. Here's the power shift most viewers never saw. Theater chains were quietly advised that the film's strongest bookings should be in suburban markets rather than downtown urban centers. The reasoning? Audience alignment. In reality, it minimized the risk of politically engaged critics amplifying the film's original themes. Distribution became containment. Meanwhile, the director felt it happening. Invitations to high-profile studio dinners slowed. A passion project he'd been developing, a noir about municipal graft, was labeled commercially uncertain. He wasn't blacklisted. That would have been dramatic. His influence simply thinned out. The screenwriter had it worse. In private correspondence, he described the edit as a polite amputation. He tried pitching a similar script to another studio. Word traveled fast. He was described as prone to heavy-handed cynicism. In that era, cynicism was a liability. America was projecting confidence abroad. Studios were expected to mirror that mood at home. Here's an unexpected political connection. This all unfolded as anti-communist sentiment was intensifying nationally. Congressional hearings were beginning to circle Hollywood. Studios were desperate to appear aligned with American values. A film implying systemic domestic corruption, even fictionally, risked being interpreted as subversive. So the studio closed ranks the way they always did, quietly. Forgotten techniques came into play again during post-production sweetening. Dialogue loopers weren't the only specialists. There were music editors trained to adjust emotional cues with surgical precision. In the original cut, the courtroom scene had minimal score. Silence pressed against the dialogue, making it raw. In the revised version, a restrained orchestral swell was added beneath the confrontation. Not dramatic, just enough to soften the blow. Music can reframe anger as sadness, suspicion as tragedy. It changed how audiences felt without them knowing why. When the film finally opened, something strange happened. A few regional critics hinted that the story felt curiously restrained. One even wrote that the film approaches controversy but retreats at the threshold. That line was buried in the middle of a longer review. It didn't catch fire, because by then, the narrative was set. The studio hosted a charity premiere tied to a veterans organization. Photographs of the lead actor shaking hands with decorated soldiers filled newspapers. The conversation shifted from corruption to gratitude, from institutional critique to personal sacrifice. Perception had been managed. The long-term Hollywood impact became clearer over the next 5 years. Screenwriters began self-editing earlier in the process. Directors pitched safer angles. The Internal Review Committee expanded its mandate. What happened to The Lantern's Edge became an unspoken lesson. Don't push too far. Here's the reflective thought that lingers. If no one publicly objected, if the film still existed in theaters, if audiences still bought tickets, was anything truly erased? Or is erasure more effective when it feels like compromise? A year after The Lantern's Edge faded from theaters, the editing room where it was reshaped had already been reassigned. New film cans stacked against the walls, fresh reels waiting for assembly. If you didn't know what had happened in that room, you'd think it was just another workspace humming along. But power leaves residue. By 1950, the studio had formalized what it once handled quietly. The Internal Review Committee became a standing department, not publicly announced. No brass plaque on the door. Just a line item in the budget under script and continuity oversight. Studio manipulation had matured. What happened to Lantern wasn't an exception, it was a prototype. Here's the unexpected revelation. Other studios noticed. Trade gossip moved fast in those days. Producers met at the same restaurants. Executives shared lawyers. And when one major studio managed to diffuse a potentially explosive narrative without public backlash, it wasn't condemned, it was studied. Hidden influence doesn't stay contained. It spreads like a crack in glass, small at first, then impossible to ignore. Writers across town began receiving quieter notes. Tone down institutional blame. Clarify personal motivations. Avoid broad indictments. It wasn't censorship in the dramatic sense. No government stamp, no official ban. It was anticipation. Studios were preemptively adjusting to avoid political heat and protect financial alliances. That's how ghost workflows evolve. They become culture. The political climate only accelerated it. As congressional investigations into alleged subversive elements in Hollywood intensified, studios tightened their posture. Executives testified about patriotism. Loyalty oaths circulated. In that atmosphere, a film suggesting coordinated corruption among American power brokers wasn't just risky, it was radioactive. The director of Lantern tried one more time to reclaim his edge. He pitched a drama centered on a city council bribery scheme. This time, the project didn't even reach casting. He was advised to consider stories that unify rather than divide. It sounded reasonable. It always did. His next film was a romance. The screenwriter's trajectory was sharper. Without consistent studio backing, he drifted into uncredited rewrite work. Ironically, he became one of the very script adjusters he once resented, smoothing dialogue, removing barbs, reshaping endings to satisfy unseen concerns. The system absorbed him. That's one of the private consequences people rarely talk about. Resistance doesn't always end in exile. Sometimes it ends in assimilation. Media spin also grew more sophisticated. Studios strengthened relationships with emerging television outlets. Cross-promotional interviews emphasized glamour, not grievance. Fan magazines ran human interest stories about stars visiting hospitals or adopting pets. The public face of Hollywood gleamed brighter than ever, even as the internal machinery grew more cautious. And here's a reputation contradiction worth sitting with. During this same period, Hollywood marketed itself as bold and progressive. It celebrated social issue films. It won awards for tackling prejudice and injustice. But those stories were carefully framed. Problems were externalized. Distant towns, individual villains, historical settings. Rarely did they point inward at contemporary power structures. The Lantern's Edge had tried to point inward. That was the difference. Now let's return to the ghost detail, the nitrate reel in the unmarked canister. In the early 1960s, a junior archivist stumbled across it while cataloging surplus material. He screened the footage privately. What he saw didn't match the official print. The courtroom scene felt harsher, the silence heavier, the judge's discomfort unmistakable. He made a note in the archive log, alternate dialogue version, possibly early cut. Possibly. No follow-up investigation, no press release, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted between production and release. By then, the industry had moved on. The old studio system was weakening under antitrust rulings and the rise of television. Control over exhibition had fractured, but the instinct to manage perception remained. It had been baked in. The long-term Hollywood impact of the Lantern scandal wasn't just narrative caution, it was psychological. Creators internalized the boundaries. They sensed where the invisible lines were drawn. Over time, those lines felt natural. It's like walking the same path through grass until it becomes a road. And here's the uncomfortable question. Did audiences lose something they never knew they had? The original cut of Lantern didn't promise revolution. It offered discomfort. It suggested that corruption might not be an anomaly, but a pattern. That idea, once softened, altered the emotional memory of the era. Because films don't just reflect culture, they calibrate it. When the archivist retired, the nitrate reel was placed back in its canister. No restoration, no duplication. Nitrate stock is volatile, fragile. One spark, and it's gone. The industry that once feared the film's message now feared the material itself. And that leaves us with a final tension before everything resolves. If the proof of alteration survives only as a brittle strip of celluloid in a forgotten vault, what happens when that last physical trace disappears? Does the sharper version of the story vanish with it? Or has the system already ensured we stopped looking long ago? In the early 1970s, long after The Lantern's Edge had slipped into late-night television rotations, the old studio storage facility on Sunset was scheduled for renovation. That unmarked canister was flagged. The technician who opened it wasn't looking for history, he was checking for decay. The film leader had already begun to bubble at the edges. When he threaded the reel onto a small inspection bench, the image flickered to life for a moment. The courtroom scene. The original line, "You don't serve justice, you manage perception." There it was, intact, unsoftened. The judge's face held a fraction longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the accusation breathe. No orchestral swell, no emotional cushion, just confrontation. By that time, the executives who ordered the edits were gone. Retired. Some deceased. The political alliances that once felt so urgent had dissolved. What had been dangerous in 1948 felt almost ordinary now. But preservation budgets are practical things. The technician logged the reel as alternate negative fragment, unstable. Restoring nitrate required money, authorization, justification. The official version of the film already existed in safer stock. From an accounting perspective, duplicating an alternate cut that had never been released didn't make sense. And this is how erasure completes itself. Not with fire, not with scandal, but with paperwork. The reel was marked for hazardous disposal. No conspiracy, no dramatic shredding. Just a decision aligned with policy. Studio manipulation had evolved into institutional habit. Hidden influence didn't need active guardians anymore. The system knew how to protect its own narrative by default. When the reel was destroyed, nothing in the public record changed. Film history still described The Lantern's Edge as a modest post-war drama with uneven pacing. The director remained a footnote in discussions of transitional cinema. The screenwriter's sharper instincts were remembered, if at all, as flashes of promise. The ghost workflows that reshaped the film were never formally documented. They didn't need to be. Their success was measured by absence. And here's the long-term Hollywood impact that lingers. The industry learned that control doesn't require spectacle. It requires coordination. A phone call here, a rewrite there, a marketing shift, a distribution tweak, a budget decision decades later. Influence didn't collapse when challenged. It thinned out, adjusted, survived. By the time new Hollywood directors began openly criticizing power structures on screen, the original Lantern scandal was already buried. Younger filmmakers assumed earlier generations had simply lacked courage. They didn't see the quiet pressure, the subtle containment, the way media spin could redirect a narrative before it hardened into public memory. Because Hollywood didn't just create legends, it managed perception. That's the thread running from the dim projection room in 1948 to the disposal form in the 1970s. The pivot point wasn't only the private screening where executives shifted in their seats, it was the realization that stories could be recalibrated after completion, and that audiences would rarely know the difference. The illusion wasn't that corruption didn't exist, it was that its portrayal could be controlled. Stand on that old lot today, and you won't find Stage 12 the way it was. Renovations, new soundproofing, digital rigs where arc lights once hummed, the chalk marking on the concrete floor, Lantern, Court RM, has been painted over more than once. Layers of gray sealing it in. It's still underneath. That feels right. Because the scandal wasn't about a single line of dialogue. It was about a system proving it could sand down a narrative without leaving fingerprints. A studio politics machine that understood timing, optics, and human psychology better than most governments. A network of forgotten techniques, redubbing, sweetening, narrative reframing, that could turn accusation into ambiguity. And here's the quiet truth that settles in after all of it. Audiences trusted what they were shown. They assumed unevenness was artistic choice. They believed softened endings reflected creative compromise. They didn't see the invisible hands adjusting the temperature. The original line existed for a while. It flickered in a private room. It survived on fragile nitrate for 2 decades. Then it vanished, like breath on glass. Hollywood didn't need to publicly ban the Lantern's edge. It didn't need to blacklist its creators or announce a moral crusade. It just managed perception until the sharper version felt unnecessary. And when the last physical trace of that sharper version was destroyed, nothing dramatic happened. No headlines, no protests, just a story, slightly blunted, settling into history as if it had always been that way. Hollywood didn't just erase a scandal. It proved it could decide which version of the truth would age and which would quietly disappear.